Witam ponownie Państwa.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, again. Let's start the second part of the HYDE Park, and let's start the first discussion panel we have planned for today. And we are going to discuss the implementation of BIM standards. Do we need the standards? Do we have national demands, or are we going to create our own? Or do we need to have some standards based on some international ones which are successful there? And do we need to have the same standard level for the volume size or for infrastructure? And the discussion panel, which is going to be started now, we are also going to have the Q&A session, and please ask your question in the chat which is available to you. So let's start, and let me welcome the participants of the panel. So in the alphabetical order, Paweł Kuczaj, the Central Communicational Hub. Welcome, Paweł, welcome. Dariusz Jędrychowski, the Polish Power Grid. Welcome. Grzegorz Kuczaj, the head of the public roads in the Ministry of Infrastructure. Welcome. Jan Steliński, the head of Polish Association of Construction Industry Employers. We cannot hear you. Jan, your microphone seems to be off. No, it's all fine. That's all fine now. Wojciech Marszałek, the head of the Department of Infrastructure Preparation, Polish Railway Lines. And Tomasz Żuchowski, the General Directorate of Polish Roads and Motorways. The director will join us shortly. So now let's not wait for the last panelist to join us, and he will join us within the panel. And let's start. The first question is, let me ask Dariusz Jędrychowski and Wojciech Marszałek. You represent the ordering parties who run BIM pilot projects, and you implement those. And many speak about adjusting of BIM and developing of national BIM standards. What are your experiences in this regard? Do we really need those standards, as each ordering party is a little bit different, each tender, each bidding process is a little bit different, or probably we should define all those regulations on the level of the tendering? So let me first ask Dariusz Jędrychowski to answer the question. Thank you very much, and let me start a very brief introduction. As the Polish Power Grids in 2017 in their strategy approved the investment process and improvement based on the new investment model, and under this new model we started from in the implementation of the BIM methodology, and we started with this in 2017, and the process is long-running. It's probably due to the fact that at that time our knowledge was not enough, and it was not easy to achieve, and our other knowledge was not easy to achieve. So we had to, based on other standards, I mean the British standards, do we need to have in place standards in Poland? Do we need to have our Polish standard? It seems that definitely we do need to have this standard, but it should be a standard which will define the processes we need to use over time in the course of investment based on BIM. It is not about making the standards very detailed, as your observation is that the ordering parties, the industries have their specificities, and it is difficult to impose with a single standard, particularly the standard which is some kind of new thing for many players in the market of investments. It is all about it is to transfer or to notify everyone what kind of processes need to be used, and we need to define some rules like the model verification processes, or the data specification for geo-information data, some nomenclature which needs to be used as a standard, like LOG, LOE, LOD, geometry details for all the participants of the works based on BIM methodology to be able to use the same language. And it is also important for the processes to be defined, and they need to facilitate works at least to the extent of how much in detail some designing data should be. We are talking about a model which would include a huge volume of data, and let's say that this overproduction or too large volume of data will make this available only for very specialist software and very expensive software, not to mention the hardware. And this model needs to be available for all the players, all the users. Like for us, that should be the traffic regulator, and they wouldn't have to be required to use a very sophisticated software and hardware, and all this we need to make this matter to be common, and the framework to be defined by the standard should be enough for us to operate within the standard, but they shouldn't make it more difficult to apply by over complexity. And let me also ask about a more specific aspect. Yes, you mentioned different aspects of creating of models, but also the managing of data. As some people who are not BIM experts, they should be able to use the model. They should be able. Thank you very much. That's very important. And let me also ask Wojciech Marszałek, as PLK also is applying some pilot projects, so you must have some experiences with this. From my experience, let me add that our project, it is quite small. It is a bridge, but that's we wanted to practice the methodology, and it was a new thing for us. So we were supported by a consultant, and the standard. This is the common language we need to use, and they are indispensable. So this is why we are based on the English model, which was used by our consultants. And standard is necessary for us to speak the same language and for all of us to be able to understand things. And the lesson learned from the designing process, as we came to the end of the project, we developed a construction and the designing documentation. That's what we have developed, and now we are going to implement the design. And what is the most important with the standard is that we need to find a common language, and among all these details, as all these elements will require some memory in our computers, and to avoid pumping all these sizes to be huge, as this will prevent many people to use. So briefly speaking, we have been building a bridge with a track and grid, but the railway grid, it is a repeatable infrastructure. So this is based on track or sleepers on some grid and some cables. So this is very briefly speaking. So the standard for the railway should be a little bit separate, should be a little bit different, as we need to be able to model things in a more general things, and we shouldn't go much into details, as connecting of sleepers seems to be quite common, and this would require a lot of memory in the software. So after the discussion, we gave up doing this, as we just have sleepers with some kind of dimension, and this is So for all railway people, it is very clear, and they know this. The same is with the traction pole, and so modeling of the traction poles one-to-one is not required. So we need to have the standard as a common language, and so we also to stay clear. That's all from us about our very fresh experiences. Do you confirm that what is the most important in the BIM methodology, that we shouldn't exaggerate with the volume of information? So modeling of things which are obvious doesn't make sense. And we shouldn't burden our computers, we shouldn't burden our models. Is that right? Do you confirm that? Exactly, this is what I mean. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have Mr. Żuchowski with us? Oh, we have the director with us. Good morning, Director. I'm very happy to be with you, Mr. Director. As I have asked the first question, let me repeat it. As you participate in the pilot projects, we would like to know your opinion. I mean, what is the opinion of the public buyers? What is the standardization in your experiences? Is the standardization with the implementation of BIM methodology, do we really need it? Do we need to have the implementation on the national level, or do we need to have the local implementations, as each buyers are different and they have their own specificity? What is your perspective? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for being able to connect with you. Let me say that the standardization need to be coordinated on the national level, but there are no obstacles, and the specificity of investments demonstrates that they are different for different stakeholders. However, we need to have models and descriptions, as some elements are repeatable. So all these models need to be tailor-made for different investors. And what has also been mentioned, that firstly, we need to do it as a country very smartly and being responsible. As all we know, that yesterday's, present, and tomorrow's discussion is also we should also involve the British Embassy. And so Britons did it many years ago, and they implemented BIM, and they did it on the national level, on the governmental level, and they involved different organizations, national organizations, but they also added contractors, specialists, designers, and they all are implementing all these actions, and these actions were coordinated on the national level, and they said, we wouldn't be able to do it without you. This is a tool for you, for the industry, for those who build, who construct, who design. So without universities, without constructors, designers, the government wouldn't be able to do it, but the government would be able to pilot the things. So I believe, I am convinced that this is the only action which can guarantee that we will achieve what we want to achieve. And the pilot activities carried out by the General Directorate, important for a buyer like we are, will create some portfolio for us. And we will have this portfolio will be ready for us to use, and it can be re-implemented in other industries, like in critical energy, gas system, or roads constructors. So they will be able to develop their own models, but this general package should be developed on the national level. So whenever the railway line crosses the gas grid, all these things will be pre-developed. So without strengthening of the message, we will not be able to do much, and we can discuss a very long time. But I believe all of us, as in the United Kingdom or in France, they do their designs with BIM, so we should also have it here. And I believe this kind of conference should channel us. That, of course, the authorities are very important, but without all those people involved, also need to be involved.
Thank you very much. Exactly, this is as it is, because we want to know who can do what. And let me welcome the next participant, Mr. Shostak from PKP PLK. Good morning. PKP is strongly represented by two panelists. Would you like to add something to what your colleague from your company told us about your experience on pilot project? No, I wanted just generally regarding this. We have some experience which, when ending this pilot project, I can summarize, and I think this will be a signal for further activities for broader application of BIM within our projects, which we will be implementing or planning in the nearest future. And this aspect which you have just mentioned, that means how that would be translated into the issues related to legislation, or some terms, and how we are to standardize it as a country, and we as an ordering party are to implement it. Thank you very much. So let us stay with standardization, because what you mentioned suggests that your experience tell you that the standardization is needed. Standardization at the national level, perhaps a little bit localized from the perspective of type of investment and type of the ordering party, whereas right away a question arises whether these standards should be hard or soft. Are we going into standards which at the beginning were well, good practices or guidelines, but these guidelines are not implemented by 100%. They are showing in which direction we should go. So if in our country we were standardizing, for example, Ministry of Development or Ministry of Infrastructure, or some body which will be appointed at governmental level will start doing standardization of BIM, should this standardization be a hard one, a classic standard, it must be like this, we all have to follow, or rather than that, it should be soft inform, and then every ordering party would choose from the start what is most fitting their specialty and their organization? Let me ask Mr. Grzegorz Kuczaj to be the first to answer this question. I will take the opportunity to start by saying that we should answer the question what standard we are discussing. Are we talking about standard in the context of implementation of the technology as such? Because in my opinion such implementation should be legal in character, so we will not avoid the law or resolution. But if we talk of the implementation standard of BIM, then I think in Ministry of Infrastructure we have quite broad experience, and I think that the path we have assumed, I will tell you about in a moment, would also prove right in this topic we are discussing today. And namely, it is that for 3 years actually we have been doing quite broad work on modifying the technical construction regulations. In construction, technical construction regulations so far were grouped in a resolution actually issued based on the law. So designing standards were at the same time legal regulations. So there were certain consequences as a result of breach to these. But now we are going astray from these being detailed standards, and regardless whether they are going to be standards for designing or maintenance or BIM, because we are touching on this subject, for them not to be regulated by legal stipulations, so to be very hard in character, but rather than that to become certain templates and standards recommended by the minister. We believe that this approach is better by the fact that we are showing potential users or investors certain best solutions. That means proven, elaborated by specialists, and we are telling them Look, we have done loads of good work for you. If you are interested, take this standard because it is best. But at the same time, with such an approach, we are not saying that you must not benefit of a different one. So in my opinion, such approach is good. But what remains is the question of deciding what should be clearly defined without leaving any choice. And I think there are such issues like questions related to certain terminology and remote processes. These are matters which should be standardized so that they are applied in a uniform way all over the country. But as I said, not in the stipulation of law, because it will not work. It has not been working so far, and in BIM it will not work. So be it Polish standard or other technical documents, standards, guidelines, this can be discussed, but clearly it should be soft in character. And here is yet another issue, in my opinion, that this initial stage of implementing BIM in Poland should leave a bit more freedom of choice for contractors. But in further stages, if we are more experienced, we could reduce and make those standards more narrow regarding a number of solutions applied, and this would work, in my opinion. I think this approach you mentioned is superb, but it requires more work of you, because allowing such flexibility, which is highly demanded, you at the same time must assure what you mentioned, that at a certain level this flexibility must not be there, because we must not come to a situation when two entities participating in one process would pick from the existing standard in force. They would choose soft solutions, resulting in lack of possibility to cooperate between them. So for you, it is much bigger a task if, or compared to this being a hard standard. But for all participants to the process, it is much better if the standards are soft in character, when they can be adjusted, adapted. So let Mr. Dariusz Jędrychowski answer the same question. Well, so I would say that earlier I said that standards should generally be describing processes, but in certain legislative areas, I guess we will not be able to avoid, let's say, hard regulations, stipulations. Well, I mean public procurement law, and definitely we will touch on construction law. And I also think that regarding BIM methodology, it is extremely important. I mean, the safety of data storage and transfer. And here one must not, well, we are talking of the future, also big public investments of strategic importance, and it seems that certain limitations, restrictions regarding safety of this data would have to be hard in character, not mentioning intellectual property. Because at this moment lots of extremely significant information items would be available for various participants to the investment process, and protecting oneself from a consequence of losing this type of information should be significant. Clear. About other matters related to technologies or implementation, realization, this should, of course, be soft in character, and it should provide the possibility to possibly best use BIM methodology, but it must not impose this or other way of implementation of the investment project. Mr. Director, I'm addressing Tomasz Żuchowski. Your opinion about whether it should be soft or hard. I'm asking especially because, as far as I know, you introduced a year ago completely new standards related to geological survey. So you are structuring the question of standardization of cooperation with your contractors and the ZR project. So implementation of BIM. Should these standards, based on your experience, be hard or soft, or are we going to towards something in between? Okay, thank you very much. I think the input by my predecessors, both by Mr. Kuchai as well as the one before, it suggests that it must be a little bit hard, a little bit soft. In English it is flexible, I mean adaptable. So I think adaptable, flexible, but more adaptable fits to both inputs. I actually approve of, and everywhere where it must be constant, that means hard, looking at the solutions which have been measured, weighed, and inventory made of them. We are convinced that it must be checked and verified, and at this moment look like this. Let it be hard here, and other activities, as Mr. Kuchai said, flexible, related to be in the given technology or optionality or designer's approach to achieve the basic conditions. So functionality, quality and safety should be flexible by all means, so that within applying these standards they keep evolving all the time, because talking in the technological language, grouting standard as such will not give us anything positive alone. And as it was said, and what I am trying to outline in my brief input, it will have the aspect of usability and be good for the idea we are discussing today. Thank you very much. Thank you for the answer to this question. Among our panelists today, we have one person who represents a broadly understood market of general contractors. Why so? Because we have limited number of places on the panel, and time is limited, so meeting all general contractors or those who have greatest experience in BIM would be very difficult in this panel. Therefore, today we invited Mr. Jan Styliński, President of Polish Association of Employers in Construction, organization grouping those largest companies, general contractors, and also one that took up their own initiative in standardization, and for a few months this initiative has been strongly heard of. I mean, BIM PL we are talking about. So well, from the idea for BIM standard PL, what were your objectives when you were preparing this elaboration, and who should benefit from it? Good morning, I hope you hear me. Well, it is very quiet, so maybe I will modify it a bit. Yes, the microphone is very near my face. I will probably hold it because for some reason it doesn't want to catch the voice. So it is better. Let me welcome you once again. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. And the question well, from the idea and who should benefit from BIM standard PL? Well, the idea came from observations from, but also from good relations, professional relations among specialists whom we have in Poland involved in BIM in various places at various levels. We were trying to follow the best examples applied in between market administration and, first of all, in the UK, or such soft active cooperation, which seems had been missing in Poland for years. I think that entrepreneurs should take upon themselves the burden of action, and we wanted to go on the track traditionally blaming administration and expecting that administration would produce documents needed by the market and which would be helping in implementation of BIM. Here we decided that it would be more efficient if we started from market's own initiative, and then to this market initiative we would invite administration at a certain stage. And here undoubtedly this observation, which was at the foundation of decision making to work on BIM PL standard, were quite negative effective experience between market and administration, especially from years 2007, 2014, 2015 in investment projects, especially in the area of utilizing and using examples, templates. Let me risk to a reflection-free approach to applying various examples, templates. I mean FIDIC standards, first of all, and this dwelling in those examples not necessarily had input in many successes in the market, and unfortunately to a lot of failures it did. So looking from this perspective, when we start copying in Poland a certain model which had existed, it will be probably difficult to construct or implement into our market one-to-one such examples from abroad, which in our market would be able, without modifications and in pure form, to start working. And looking from this perspective, we decided that more effective will be an attempt at creating a certain document, a certain standard, which from day one would be fitted for Polish market. But this is only one of the elements, because if it was a standard created only by the market, then of course opportunity for broad and effective influence of such standard on the market, especially on public market or public procurement market, would not be the greatest. And without involvement by administration, such a project would be yet another project which would, with honors and certificates, end up on the shelf and not necessarily could be translated into life. So therefore our basic assumption was practically starting certain work, creating a document which could form basis for further work with administration, and inviting this administration to our initiative, so that at the end of this process we work out a document which would be a document in common, where both parties, the market and the administrative party, the investors, would feel united. So at this stage, our strong partner who co-created this document and who subject-wise very strongly got involved in the current document, which to some extent has been in public space, it was Public Procurement Office. We are aware that for the time being it is collecting the first ideas and the first stage of structuring the knowledge regarding BIM, which experts in Poland have, and which is owned by the Polish market. Whereas we will be able to brush up this document together when into this process by sharing their experience. GDDK, PLK, or PSL will join in. PLK, together with Director Żuchowski, we discussed this process, and I can see great openness and awareness that good product, good document, we will be able to create it in 2-3 years, whereas the process of reassumption, which is published today, and including into it the whole set of experience and thoughts which will result from projects run by investors today, and on the other hand, the feedback or the input from the market would be our considerations, our thoughts and experience gathered so far, but also those which, in cooperation with investors over the coming 2-3 years, will be gained by us. Regarding superior goal, so an absolutely fundamental objective is to run investment processes in construction in Poland at top European level, so that our construction is modern construction and being in at the same pace or giving even the pace to European construction. Of course, intermediate goals are avoiding those errors from the past years, such distribution and quite individualistic approach to standards, but also proposing, if possible, to carry it out, introduce BIM standard as a Polish standard, which would be applied in proceedings. So close to us is the soft approach, showing rather certain standards and guidelines rather than fixed stipulation in legislation on how BIM should operate in Poland, and who should this document serve? Well, we assume it is an open one, so from everybody, from investors, from contractors, may download this document from our page or from public procurement office where the document is published together with attachments and with certain awareness and recognition of values concluded in the document should benefit from it. Thank you very much. Let me refer to what you said, Mr. President, because as I have been involved in BIM for a few years now, and I see some regular phenomenon. I don't know, is it because the BIM is appearing and forcing certain action? This is a win-win strategy which makes parties which had always been conflicted, so general contractors, the ordering parties, start talking to one another, and often BIM, which is being implemented, is a catalyst, not necessarily to implementation of BIM alone, but to changes in the structure of managing processes, managing information. So BIM is not only BIM, it results in us beginning to cooperate rather than being antagonized all the time in the construction process. It is great. So when we talk of these standards, all that, I have a question then, briefly. The cubature or infrastructure should go first, because here we have public ordering parties, so GDDK, PKP, PLK, Polish grid, electro-energy grid. So these are ordering parties mainly working as ordering party for linear infrastructure. On the other hand, most common and available standards are related to volume cubature. So very often we are actually modeling in linear infrastructure using the cubature. So therefore my question, because BIM standard PL is dedicated to the volume, the cubature. So what is more important, establishing cubature based on examples worldwide, or a standardizing investment, because those investment projects are really very many? Perhaps I will ask you, who are experienced in relation to standardization or investment projects. Let me ask Mr. Grzegorz Kuczaj to be the first person to answer. Well, regarding the fact whether we should first take care of cubature or linear investment projects, it's hard to clearly say yes or the other way around. Definitely, these standards are more difficult to be implemented in cubature investment projects because investor is very limited. Usually it is one entity. In case of introducing some standards for public roads, please realize that those who manage public roads are mainly representatives of local authorities. So we are entering a couple thousand entities which would be to apply this standard. It's not like in case of railways, where we have one basic managing authority of railway infrastructure. Here in public roads, there is a huge dissemination. So, of course, it is easier to apply BIM in cubature. We have a specific unit on a specific land plot, usually one or just a few, whereas linear infrastructure, it's hundreds of plots, hundreds of infrastructure items, and hundreds of units which can be specified in such a construction unit like public roads. So I think we should anyway carry out activities in both these fronts. Introducing BIM in linear investment project is important because there, first of all, public money is invested. And as experience tells us, not applying BIM technology in those investment projects often results in us not having control on delays in implementation of those projects. So I think that BIM should facilitate this process and make it more efficient. It is not only important thing, but also the whole process of managing the infrastructure, so that it would definitely have an input in optimization of costs. And let me remind you, this is public money. So system for funding such investments versus cubature investment projects, at least for this reason, it is worthwhile to implement this technology regarding linear infrastructure. Thank you very much. So now let me ask Mr. Paweł Buczak to answer this question. Central Communication Hub investment project, which I don't know the full scope, but I can imagine that this is an investment project which is both linear and cubature, volume one. And what is your opinion? Because you will be going into one and the other type. So first, linear infrastructure or cubature. If I could answer directly, the solution would have to be covering both volume, cubature, and linear projects. However, here we have to clash with reality, reality of linear projects, the railway project, where we have many more limitations compared to volume cubature solutions. Well, let us remember earlier we had discussion about standards. In linear projects, in railway projects, not only the regulator and legislative matters are the area of construction law, but also everything which is related to the area of so-called European law, earlier directives and interoperability. In the railway component, we have three elements: structural, infrastructure, rail, sleeper and base fixing, energy plus power supply system at each of them, and subsystem of controlling. Generally, at each of these subsystems, already there are some bottlenecks. And on the other hand, these regulations have to inhibit BIM standards. Therefore, the first step, for example, for the component in linear projects is to stabilize and to answer the question, what standards shall we have on railway lines regarding, especially, in my opinion, of the bottleneck of the control subsystem, and only then we should put BIM standards on it. This is a challenge to implement BIM. Legal, technical limitations result in us not being able to to implement it in a much simpler way to implement the BIM methodology. Well, regarding the airport, regarding the volume, the cubature, limitation is not only provided by civil law, but construction law. So I find it hard to refer not only to security solutions in individual areas, but also what is most important, safety. This is also a limitation for implementation in a quick way of BIM standards. And in order to correctly implement this, one should create standards of hybrid character, in my opinion. So for certain areas, be it cubature or linear projects, we should go more into detail or less into detail in BIM standards. But this is unfortunately related to very specific to the given area knowledge. We have no chance to go away from BIM, and we should implement these standards parallelly to avoid wasting time. Thank you very much.
Let me ask Wojciech Marszałek from PKP PLK. I believe your opinion is going to be univocal, as you are mainly concentrated on the linear investments, but I believe you also handle the things like with the bridge, using only the standards available for buildings. Of course, I definitely would agree with this. However, our building structures like bridges, and it was also involving linear investments. But I would agree with my predecessor, and I would say that there is a very narrow separation line as in the road we have the traffic law. Also, we have some strict regulations in more and so I'd like also to adding more to the previous question, I would more go with hybrid. Law is law. Of course, it is very important as the safety is supreme, but also the standards should be soft and supporting elements for the linear solutions. And so I believe it is important how to find a good balance. As the railway, it is some kind of standard. Rail, sleepers, and some kind of repeatability. But BIM models, it is a standard applied to some other things, like some collisions, which we face in the implementation phase. So good model, good design would give us or allow us to avoid some things in the implementation phase. And it is also very important from the maintenance point of view, as a good model will also allow us to optimize the maintenance cost of our infrastructure. So as I said before, for us, we would like to have both the building and also the linear standards, and we have automatic control, and the infrastructure was not very extensive for us to demonstrate our abilities. We had a power supply and also the railway infrastructure. So these two subsystems were involved, but it is difficult to say. So I believe the hybrid system at PLK would be definitely the most beneficial. That's all from me. Thank you. Thank you. And the same question goes to Mr. Naszczyński, general contractors, both building facilities and linear infrastructures. I believe that the general contractors are much more efficient with BIM in buildings, as they have standards available, not Polish, but international ones. But the situation is different with the infrastructure. What is your standpoint? What is more important, the building structures or linear infrastructure standards? If we look at the entire infrastructure, like roads and railways, so this is not very significant volumes. So in numbers, we are going to have like 230 billion zlotys involved in installations, and the road and railways, it is 55 billion. So if you look at this from this perspective, so the vast majority of the construction industry, it is building. So buildings have this most important influence on the Polish market, but also from the practical point of view, it is not the case, as some governmental infrastructure contracts significantly affect some kind of climate of cooperation among the administration and the market, and they affect the model of behaviors and significantly affect the developmental abilities or lacking developmental abilities. So it is difficult to answer the question if in the Polish realities what is more important, building or linear infrastructures. I would say that they are comparable. Without both of these investments, the Polish market would be weak and definitely less important also from the European point of view versus to what we have now when we implement both types of investments. And if we look at BIM now from this perspective, it seems that the need to increase the efficiency of digitization of processes in the construction industry and increasing of the culture of the construction industry is important for both the buildings and for linear infrastructures. It is not true that only linear infrastructure and the difficult relationship of the government and the contractors is important. But also this lacking culture was clearly visible in the investments where private investors were involved. And it is due to the common lack of efficiency, which could be achieved with better management solutions. And why did we start with what we did? As we want to base on the in the buildings, I believe it is easier to implement BIM. As for buildings, it is difficult to use. We have more of those than roads, and also the fact that we have a lot of dispersed investors, more dispersed than in linear infrastructure, facilitates the improving of errors, which definitely will be the case when we implement the BIM in Poland. And based on these experiences, we should try to avoid the same errors for linear investments. Please imagine how difficult it would be for many contractors and investors in linear investments if we apply BIM standards in linear railway investments or road investments, first of all. And how difficult it would be if, in many cases, some errors, imperfections, how these things would infect other processes. So historically, also, the same error was made when we were applying design and build method. It is not easier than BIM. And 10 years ago, there was made a brave decision to apply this approach in many investments, and many of those investments face different problems. So if we look at this from this perspective, I believe applying this methodology first to buildings, improving of the process and getting of the experiences and improving of the standards and applying it to more extent to the linear investment would be more beneficial for the market and for both contractors and investors. Thank you. And in your presentation, I was looking at the chart, and you cannot see that, but we also have a team of young people serving this conference, and they provide me information. And I do not have any specific questions, but we also have a very vibrant discussion on data saving, which system is good and which one is not. And now, speaking to our audience, whenever we speak about the standard, we are not only talking about the data saving system and is EFC good or not. We are talking about the standardization very broadly understood. But let me just read one comment. Jacek Klanowski. And I believe it is very important, and so especially in the context of our discussion about the standards, probably we need to look at the Hungarian presentation, their approach. Firstly, they started with collecting of geological data, and they now implement the 3D models, and so all the Polish presentations forget about GML language. So let me comment on this. This is not truly true, as I personally know that a lot of things have been done about in this junction of BIM and GIS. And for quite a long time, this connection has been appreciated, and creating something more than just models of buildings is important. So I believe in a short time, more and more, we are going to hear about how BIM can be connected with GIS and how land surveyors can be involved in BIM beaming process. And gentlemen, those who represent the buyers, so you define the BIM process. And the question is quite complex, so let me read it. In the BIM methodology, key is the strategy stage, particularly the mobilization phase, so getting of the competences of the team and preparing of the technical resources. So that's what we are going to discuss in the next panel. So competences of BIM personnel. So your organizations, do you have any plan of implementation from the perspective of your resources, like training your people, your staff? I can say that I have contact with General Directorate for National Roads and Motorways in Krakow, and they have very high competences in terms of applying BIM methodology. They have the hands-on experience and theoretical knowledge, but this is the pilot phase, so how to distribute the knowledge within the organization. Do you want to base on your own resources, your own teams, or do you want to involve some external people who have more experience? So what is your idea? What is your strategy for implementation of BIM? So let me ask you one by one, the buyers. So let's go from the anti-alphabetical order. Mr. Żuchowski, would you be able to speak as the first one? I think we cannot hear you. Thank you for the question. Now I can hear the question. Alluding to the previous question, I believe both the buildings and the linear investments should be done independently. I have been supporting BIM for about 5 years, and I would say that we have to do it. And the faster, the more efficiently our approach is, the better it is. And this will be better distributed, spread throughout organizations and institutions. And we will be doing things in our way, but the more difficult it will be to put the things together. So that's the second aspect. And the third aspect is that hopefully there will be someone, let's say, on the central level, like the Ministry of Development and Technology and Labor. So this ministry combines all these competences which we all want to have. So hopefully they will create the matrix of development. They will collect all this data which is now dispersed. And hopefully they will put all these things together to create standards. And what we have on the table now, what we are missing, so the ministry should develop, should tailor a strategy for all stakeholders which are here in this room and participate in the panels or who are just listening to panels. I think it is of key importance, as the conferences are not only to talk about the problems, but we need to concentrate on hear the voices. And what I can hear is that people say it is not possible now, but let's talk. And I used to work in the Ministry of Infrastructure, and we have a series of conferences on this. And we have a report on that, and the knowledge has not forwarded much, taking into account the knowledge we have gathered. So what we need now, we need to do it. And for the standards, you have been talking about them. We also need to answer the question what we need to achieve. And whenever we speak about standards, a lot of things can be included in the standards. Many variables need to be included, like the data exchange format, cooperation of organizations, about the transferring of information, what kind of documents need to be available in the construction site, and what kind of channels and technical, economical, environmental approaches. So we need to face some elements, and we need to have a model from the software point of view, and needs to be coherent for us to be able to say that we need to facilitate our activities. And also the main construction office is digitizing the building permits, and you need to have a PDF and the signatures. On the perspective we are talking about like CDF, so PDF is not BIM, and we have another failure. So only well-considered approach, it will take like 1 or 2 years, but it needs to be tailored. And this is only how we can achieve what we want. As in 3 or 4 years, we may meet again. And we are, of course, BIM fanatics or supporters. And so we can meet in 3 or 4 years again and discuss what is missing. So I hope that we will be responsible enough as the buyers, but also as a Polish state, as the entities spending billions for infrastructures like ourselves. In this perspective, as we have 162 billion zlotys, so this is only for building of roads and motorways. We have 28 billion extra, so hopefully we will be ready for the solutions in the new perspective. And also the reconstruction fund, the money which will be available to spend, all this should be designed in the model, using the model, which firstly, from the model perspective, we need to build things faster, faster, faster. So hopefully the BIM will be efficient, and in 10 years from now, we should be able to say that we have all the tools and instruments to efficiently manage the maintenance of the infrastructure. As from my perspective, what is important in BIM, it is we need to have a good input for diagnostics and monitoring of the facilities we build. As from the paperwork perspective, the facilities we have, we are able to build them, we are able to commission them, but those thousands of express roads and motorways and maintenance of infrastructure in a good condition, some countries also have this kind of experience, so I believe that BIM it is a big problem, and if we fail to do it, and I'm looking at this from the perspective like 2025, so we will be delayed versus other countries which firstly would be able to do it, which wanted to do it, and they wanted to know what kind of requirements they need to set. So in the individual areas, we are applying this, but it is also important for us to carry out some meetings, and we need to transfer to digitization process, and a lot of things should be done. I think we need to have 2 or 3 years to get into different reality, and building of competences on the buyer's side will be also useful for others who would take the key decision in the BIM implementation system. But regardless of the development of the situation, we will be heading for the solutions which would make the investments, investing modeling will be more efficient for buyers like ourselves. Thank you. We need to speed up, so we have only 13 minutes, and we have a couple of interesting questions. Let me ask the same question to Mr. Jędrychowski. Director, Mr. Director, competences, BIM competences of your team. Let me briefly allude to the previous question, or we only have a dozen or so minutes, so let me concentrate on that. Generally, we have to implement a linear infrastructure approach, as this is what we deal with, and that's important for us. So this is why we developed our standards by ourselves, and what we did, the requirements, not standards. So our approach was that we created our own team, and we also hired an external company with experience on BIM as a methodology generally. And now these competences are enough to limit the participation, the involvement of external partner. So the competences of our team are significant. And meanwhile, we have had some meetings and workshops with all our departments. And firstly, we gathered information on what would be the requirements of these departments from BIM, and that would be also information for these departments that BIM would be implemented in our company. We have also provided them information on how we are going to implement. So we have completed this presentation phase. I wouldn't call that trainings. And within the team I lead, the training elements like preparing of the training plan and like who, when, and how. So we started this month, and by the end of the month, we plan to develop an outline of the program and the implementation of the training process, either by our company, our subsidiary, like PEC Innovatio, or the external company. That's not clear, but we are going to train people extensively in the second part of the next year as the last stage of BIM implementation. So the trainings definitely are planned, and they are scheduled, but this is going to be the last element of the implementation of BIM methodology in our company. That's clear. Thank you. I'd like to ask you, gentlemen, gentlemen from PLK or CPK, but let me use the questions we have from the audience. We have many comments which should be read, but it doesn't make sense. But we also have some questions going directly to us as organizers. But the question which has appeared, that's to Mr. Żuchowski. Is the General Directorate going to extend the time frame of contracts to mobilize the teams? I'm not sure if it is applicable to your team or to your contractors, but the question goes to you. So answering the question, we wouldn't like to use this, to apply this approach, as if it is the case that BIM needs more time at the very beginning. So it means it is not the thing we want to achieve. So I hope the BIM needs to be mastered when it is implemented, and from the distribution of time in our schedules, it should be shortened from the designing perspective more than extending it. But the milestones, if these milestones can be shifted, of course we are open, but generally, the BIM should be clearly communicated that BIM is going to shorten the time, the designing phase, and in total, for all of us, for all those septics, for all of us, it should be clear that BIM is going to facilitate. It makes things flexible and speeds up the construction and designing process. And the next question, and I have one more question from our audience, which I believe are the most important. And the question is, what are the next public investors' plans for BIM projects? What is going to be the next things to carry out? What is going to be your next project? You mentioned that bridge. So answering your question directly, there is no clear decision, and the consequences of this implementation will be some kind of starting point for the analysis and making a decision on a broader application. I think it is too early to answer this univocally. Thank you. Mr. Director, the General Directorate for National Roads and Motorways. What I can say is that we have to do our best to implement things smartly, but the processes we have been talking about and we would like to implement, they should be efficient for General Directorates, and And I believe that the experiences which have been developed, and let me remind you that we have the steering committee and we also have all the universities, technical universities involved. And hopefully this will allow us to develop this kind of standard tailored for the General Directorate. And hopefully the next projects will be even more efficient and they will be more heading to this model solutions we have been talking about today. But now we have not selected a single project, as what is important for us is to get as much as possible to be as efficient as possible in the future projects. And if I may add on that, from PSE, we have 4 pilot projects, 4 stations and 1 line. And now these projects, linear projects, are implemented that the construction design is going to be submitted to the constructor applying the BIM methodology. These designs are available, but the contractors, general contractors, have not been selected. And we do not impose implementation methods. So we want to have an as-built project according to our BIM requirements. It means that the contractors may apply BIM methodology for 3 years, or they can only develop the as-built project. And in the competition dialogues, we know that there are different approaches, and we do it to avoid a situation when BIM projects will generate some extra complications, costs, as we are talking about infrastructure investments, where knowledge in the market about is not very extensive, and it is based on the requirements of our description of we provide. And also alluding to the previous question on how to implement projects for all stakeholders to be properly trained. What we want to achieve is that the market should adjust to the situation based on the information provided by us in the tendering process. Thank you. And let me also ask Paweł Dubczak from CPK a very brief saying. What are your preparations for applying the BIM methodology? I mean the team competences, personal competences, as the challenges are going to be huge and the BIM requirements affect different areas, and people are of key importance. Absolutely, absolutely, you are right. Generally, in the area of competences, I would split this. I would like to talk about the competences and risks, and we also need to split the railway and the airport component. And the airport component generates as few risks as possible, as there are standards available, but it's also the case with the team, as we have the most experienced experts and managers in the BIM area. These people are involved in the airport component, but also in the railway component we have these resources available, and the risk is related with totally different characteristics of linear investments. I believe that the most important elements which needs to be implemented, it is the focal point, I mean the railway station and the airport at the central communication hub. And our approach should be very flexible to the approaches, as we have some requirements and we also have some schedules and the BIM standards and implementation of the standards in the timeline. This must take some time. So the managers and the central communication hub needs to carry out things, and they need to apply the right projects. And I'm talking about the railway component risk, as this is not going to be a one single huge project. There are going to be many smaller or bigger projects which will be started in different dates. And these BIM standards will be developed parallelly. So we need to answer a question, how finally we need to unify all these linear projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, time is over. Oh, gosh, but quite many interesting questions and statements popped up here. So I will take the opportunity to say 3 sentences to wrap up based on what I read on our chat. Well, firstly, a comment by Tomasz Reipold, which I agree with completely, and most BIM experienced people will agree with it. Project in BIM technology doesn't need more time, but change in implementation of the plan, because we need more time for making the model after the project, after design. So as Mr. Żuchowski said, time is not changing. It's only a question of changing priorities during implementation. The second comment is my comment to the question I did not manage to ask you, but I assume that I know your answer to it. My question was, don't you think that it is worthwhile to think of a broad cooperation platform? I don't mean IT platform, between ministries of infrastructure and development. Here we have volume, cubature, and here linear, between Polish Standardization Committee, academia, and social organizations, largest general contractors, in order to work out common roadmap for standardization. I'm not talking of map of implementation of BIM in Poland, but standardization map, because in our chat here, the discussion which developed proves that not quite fully we understand those terms. For example, a statement appeared that such a soft implementation of BIM is not the best because it results in part of organizations are not willing to implement it. Today we were not talking of soft implementation of BIM, but of soft standards, and guidelines should be hard regarding implementation thereof. It is a decision at the level of public administration bodies, at the level of the government. We are applying the BIM mandate for some investment project, and according to which standards? Well, this is the discussion today we had the pleasure to run. And the last thing I wanted to mention, because here also very strongly it was quoted in our chat. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we met in such a group of people, not other, but this does not prove that it is only these institutions, these public ordering parties implement BIM on their premises, because what results from the chat is that, for example, Polish Waters, who do not have this overall strategy, at least I don't know one regarding implementation of BIM, they, for a long time already, they are implementing projects using BIM methodology. So, as Tomasz Żuchowski said, BIM is spreading, and ordering parties implement BIM, and it's important for every ordering party not to go along their own path of implementation, but for us to work according to the same common standards. Otherwise, there would be total chaos in the market. So with this wrap up by the moderator, I wanted to end today's first discussion panel. Thank you very, very much, gentlemen, for finding time to participate. I encourage you to listen to the next panel, moderated by Mr. Marek Saramak. It is more competence-based. Thank you very much, all of you. We have now a break until 12:30. So thank you very much, and see you.